Good day all. My name is Grant Price, and I'm the Principal Education Officer for Student Services in the Gladstone Regional Educational Office. And this morning, I was just going to chat through some thoughts around inclusive education in a modern Queensland school. And obviously, it is quite a difficult concept in terms of taking the big, broad conceptual item of what is inclusion, what is being inclusive within a societal setup, and trying to put it into structures and processes within schools that acknowledges the diverse learners that we have in our system. And the space that a lot of you are working in, especially, is the early years, that transition space into school. And obviously, there are some stresses in that space for parents. There is some uncertainty, and it is always an area where there is opportunity for further discussion and further collaboration with each other. So, what do we mean by inclusive education? It is a massively broad philosophical perspective, and it encompasses everything from overall school structure in terms of the strategic plan over a period of several years, right the way through down to the individual case management of one solitary specific student. So, a question that I like to pose when I'm doing this presentation live with people is, what does inclusive education mean to you? And it is quite amazing to see the breadth of response and interpretation. And I think that that is both a wonderful but also scary thing, in that it highlights the fact that there is no one thing that defines inclusion, and there is also no one thing that is ruled out in terms of potentially being part of a system that is inclusive. So I'm going to refer to a set of cartoon images that you may have seen previously, and it does highlight the progression that has been made in terms of concepts around inclusive practices within schools. So in the first cartoon, we have that one individual or perhaps a group that may receive more than is needed, while less is distributed to or is able to be accessed by others. And there is this disparity between those involved. And that is the original modeling that, from certain bias perspectives, certain societal advantages or disadvantages, that is a position that unfortunately a fair amount of children find themselves in, that those who are in a position to build themselves up generally had that head start to begin with. Then there is this assumption around what equality is. And the assumption is that if everyone gets exactly the same thing, so that's progression from the previous cartoon, comic strip, sorry. If we were to take this concept that everybody is getting exactly the same thing, then that is the traditional concept within schools around what does fair look like. And it's an easy one to manage in terms of every student is getting the same thing. There can be no talk about bias. There can be no feelings from children around being cheated, as in somebody else is getting more than what they are getting. It makes rules, it makes structures pretty clear, nice and black and white, that everyone gets the same thing. And we don't really consider the fact that the needs of individuals may look different. Then we start moving on to equity. So everyone receives the support they need via what is referred to as reasonable adjustments. So now reasonable adjustments is the phrasing that is used within Education Queensland's setup regarding how do we give students what they specifically need. So they are defined as what is a reasonable adjustment. And now you start seeing the smallest, shortest, youngest child ending up getting different supports to what the other two people are getting. And now we have a scenario where he or she is able to access the learning environment per se in a similar sort of fashion to what everyone else is getting. So now we start looking at people getting what they need. And then you have justice. So if we start looking at the angle of removing barriers as opposed to looking to put measures in place to overcome the barriers, and it's a fairly similar sort of outcome from the perspective of we're still addressing the needs of the individuals, but now we're actually saying, how about we look to remove the barriers, because that removal of a barrier for one student is also potentially going to have benefit across a whole nother set, a whole nother range of students. So those barriers, the causes for difficulty, have been removed or addressed. And then the last item is what is referred to as inclusion. So now we're having a scenario where you have all of these students participating, not necessarily being able to watch the game from the sideline with the barriers being removed. They're now being included and invited into the actual game itself. And that is the end goal of what we're looking to achieve in education, is to give everyone the opportunity to have a go. So obviously there is the philosophical perspective around inclusion and inclusive practices, and I don't think that there is anyone that would say that they do not believe that we need to be inclusive, that we do not need to give students what they need to have a fair go. The challenge quite often in schools, especially when you're looking at the young students who are coming in, that you are still working out what their needs look like, what the barriers are, what a reasonable adjustment could be. You're working through case management processes. Central Queensland has got a case management framework where that very expressly highlights, illustrates these steps in the process and the multifaceted approach that needs to be taken. There needs to be documents that guide that approach, that turn some of those philosophical items into actions, into structures, into uh, objectives that need to be worked towards. So some of these documents are highlighted on this presentation. The disability standards for education. There are very specific items in there from a school perspective in terms of the rights and the requirements that are associated. So there is very specific turning the philosophical into practical. There is the whole school approach to differentiated teaching and learning that talks about the whole school structure in terms of differentiating for a varying range of needs, right through to what is lesson preparation and reasonable adjustments and removing of barriers look like. Some of the overarching documents: Inclusive Education Policy Statement, Disability Discrimination Act, Disability Standards for Education, and so on and so on. So that you can see that there is really a massive amount of policy and procedure and guideline that has gone into mandating inclusive education within schools, right down to identifying certain vulnerable groups that need to have particular attention focused on in terms of acknowledging their starting point as such. And then the NCCD is a data collection mechanism that is in place in Australian schools, where schools are mandated to record the adjustments that are being made for certain students, especially in the space of disability. And there is a very set structure around what that looks like, and there are very direct links to school funding models. So schools are really having to prioritize that and get that element right. So there is a one school, there is a YouTube video, Shelley Moore, transforming inclusive education. There are multiple clips that she's got on YouTube. She is awesome. She explains quite sort of clearly what the previous comic strip was explaining. So that is key. That's the approach that is being taken, is to look for trying to provide the supports, remove barriers for the students who need it the most, because those strategies, if they're put in place correctly, will also provide additional opportunities and access for every other student within that school structure. And that is the approach that we use. I just wanted to highlight two particular items very close to my heart that I feel are massively powerful tools in terms of inclusive education structures within schools. And one is attachment, and the other one is engagement. So, attachment, as it says, is a deep and enduring emotional bond that connects one person to another across time and space. So, attachment theory explains that parent-child relationship that emerges and influences subsequent development. And obviously, that bond that is formed between a prep teacher and a prep child fits in a very similar space to that particular bond, because so often for those students coming through into school, they're still very young, still quite immature emotionally, and they need that sort of connection with an adult in their life to continue working towards goals. So there are some statistics, some of them not particularly flattering, around students who haven't managed to form those healthy attachments at a young age. And obviously, our aim is to address some of those statistics, and attachment and the way that we form attachment and grow relationships from a very early stage in formal schooling is a very high priority for us. And then attachment and engagement, and they link into each other. So secure children, in terms of attachment, they're better problem solvers, they're more curious, they've got increased quality and duration of learning, and they have higher academic achievement, and that is statistically proven. They are likely to be cooperative, have pretty good self-regulation skills, less likely to develop emotional and behavioral problems, be more socially empathetic and less biased in terms of interpreting behaviors of other students, and then more self-aware. And without that attachment, engagement is going to be really difficult to come by for a youngster, because they need to feel that someone cares about them in that space so that they want to work for that person or those people in that space. So without attachment, you're likely to struggle to find engagement. And with students who don't engage from an early on age, obviously there are quite pivotal early years markers that are missed, and it can be quite detrimental in terms of long-term impact. So ultimately, what we're trying to achieve in education is that we can say that our children become resilient grown-ups, and they will have trust and love, and they can find ways to solve problems, and they are lovable people. Thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate having you on, and I hope you have a great day.